So this morning over at First UMC of Bellevue in worship, I looked up in the back of the sanctuary. There was this lovely couple with a couple adorable small. It was the Tarpleys, and they send their love. They just wanted to know that an earlier worship time works a lot better for nap time. And I'm assuming they were talking about kid nap time and not their own nap time, but they send their greetings and their love. So. Also, my family and I are in the middle of moving right now, and if I cough, it is not me projecting COVID out on you. It is because I probably inhaled about a pound of dust from the garage of all the cardboard boxes we were moving. So if I cough a little bit, don't be afraid. This Lent, for the next 6 weeks or so, we'll be focusing on the life and faith of Peter, who is one of the more famous, if we can use that word, one of the more famous disciples. And in him, we see a person who is at times steadfast and at other times unsteady. Sometimes he's a dear friend of Jesus, but also in a moment he's a betrayer. He's a follower, but also at times he wanders away. And I think if we look closely at Peter, we could probably, each of us, see a little bit of ourselves. And so by following Peter's journey, we can see Jesus and all that is happening that leads to the cross and the resurrection through the eyes of a very normal human being who's trying to figure it all out, just like we do. And like many of us, Peter has a wandering heart, which is the name of our Lenten series. His journey, like all of ours, is not polished. His faith journey is not perfect. But no matter if he wanders or gets it right or gets it wrong, he is always tethered and connected to the love of God. And as we explore Peter's story and look at Jesus' story through the eyes of Peter, one thing we'll notice is that Jesus is always reaching out to Peter, whether it's offering him abundance or catching him when he begins to sink or challenging him when he stands in the way of something important. He washes his feet, he predicts his betrayal, and yet he offers him love. And this is something we'll return to again and again. It's not just Peter's life, but Christ's motions and reaching out towards Peter. And in this, as we journey with Peter, we're not going to idolize him, we're not going to vilify him, we're going to just walk beside him, open to what we might learn about Jesus, open to what we might learn about ourselves. One of the interesting things about Peter's story is just how imperfect he is, and how that plays out, especially today in the terms of being called and being claimed by God. So we like to think, or at least I think we like to think, that God is choosy about who is called. I've thought a lot about my early church days as a young man, pre-call into clergydom. And if you had asked me then, who is the one who is called in this worship service? I probably would have pointed directly at the pastor who was preaching and say, well, but of course, that person is the called person. He's up there, and this is the South, so we always wore robes when we worshiped. Not the people in the pews, but if you were up there, a clergy person or something, you'd wear robes and stoles and all of that. So if you'd asked me back then, who is the person that has been called? I would have first and probably only pointed at the pastor. I've changed my mind about that. But I think for a lot of us, we think that to be one of God's chosen agents of the good news, that it's reserved for special people. It's reserved for eloquent people who can stand up in front of people and speak with authority and prophecy and all of that. Or sometimes we think that it's reserved for people who have a particular force of personality, or somebody who is theologically trained, has been to seminary, or even somebody who's empowered by the Holy Spirit. Like sometimes we think God's calling comes after somebody is already full of the Spirit, and God recognizes it and says, you're already ready to go, so I'm going to call you to do this task. In Jesus' day and before that, they had a similar understanding that God's calling and God's favor was particularly reserved for the priests and rabbis of the day. And so as we encounter the text today, I want to try to ask you, even though I know this is kind of impossible, to revisit it as if it's the first time. Because many of us, not everybody, but many of us have heard this story, this text, countless times, 10, 20, 30, 100, hundreds of times. And we just go, oh, there's Jesus on the lake shore, and he runs into a couple fishermen, and he says, you follow me, you follow me. And they're like, okay, we'll follow you. So set that aside. My wife's father was a fisherman in Valdez, Alaska. And my wife was raised around fishermen. And I don't think it's a stretch, and I don't even think it's insulting to say that generally around the world, fishermen are not the most couth people in the world. They are not the most cultured people. I'm not saying they're bad or ignorant or anything like that, but fishermen tend to be rough. If you don't believe me, go find some professional fishermen somewhere. In Georgia, Mississippi, the Gulf Coast, somewhere along the Pacific Northwest coast. Go up to Alaska in particular and go visit a working commercial dock. You are not going to see a bunch of fishermen walking around in tweed, smoking a pipe, thinking about deep theological things. You are going to see men and sometimes women who are strong and scarred and probably, there's a reason when somebody says something that is a little blue in language, they say, that person curses like a sailor. Well, fishermen are known for a certain kind of language. And I'm not saying anything insulting. I just say wherever I've traveled and encountered fishermen, there's some commonalities. And they tend to be strong people who work hard. Not always as eloquent as college professors, but having their own wisdom. And so when Jesus chose to call the first disciples, we would think that the very first people he would call would be the rabbis and priests, right? They already know the religious language, they know the religious concepts, but that's not the case at all. When Jesus called the very first disciples, he went to some of the roughest people around, blue-collar working people, and chose them. Now, we could stop and just let that be the sermon, because there's a lot there for us to ponder about whom Jesus calls and why. But it goes more. But I want us to be awed and shocked by who he chose. So, I'm not going to have you do it, but internally I want you to all make a surprised, shocked sound like, wow, because we should, that's an amazing thing. It's very unusual. He initiates the relationship with them. He approaches them, and then we have this beautiful moment that is just chock-a-block full of symbolism. It's just very rich in symbolism. So as we talk through this, I want you to think symbolically. The fisherman had an unfruitful, unsuccessful, and probably very tiring night. Has anyone here gone fishing and not caught anything? Pretty much everybody. It's so boring. So boring. Everyone's like, oh, it's peaceful and meditative. No, it's not. You are annoyed. You didn't go there to not catch anything. You went there to catch something. And you're not working very hard if you're just tossing a line out. It's just a lot of this. But these fishermen weren't just standing on the shore tossing a line out. They were on boats out there. And if you've ever worked with fishing nets, it's heavy. It's heavy, dirty, wet work. And they did it pretty much all night, which is exhausting. I remember right after my first child was born, they moved us, and she was born late afternoon. They moved us into this little side room, and my dear mother-in-law was there, thank goodness, and she joined us in there. And so my wife, Rachel, was there in bed. She had our daughter. I was on this little thing on the floor, and my mother-in-law was in the bed over here. And we all tried to sleep, and my mother-in-law snores more than anybody. And she slept wonderfully all night long. And Rachel and I and my daughter didn't sleep a wink. And it was the longest night in history. And you've probably all had long nights where there's just no sleep to be had, whether you're at the bedside of somebody in the hospital or something. Like, just being awake all night is hard. Working all night is even harder. I bet there's some of you who've worked night shifts. So this is when Jesus catches these men. They're coming off the water having worked all night long. And they weren't happy. They didn't catch a thing. It's also important to remember that most fishermen and fisher people, we say fishermen, but there are women who are fishers too. I actually know somebody, a female who has her own fishing boat up in Alaska, that they tend to go to the same fruitful fishing spots, right? Back then, it used to be knowledge that was passed down from parent to child. Here and here and here are the fishing grounds. Now it's coordinates in a GPS thing, but it's the same. Boats don't just wander the lakes and wander the oceans looking for fish. They go to the same spots. So we can assume that this group of fishermen did the same thing, and then Jesus tells them to go to deep waters, which you get the sense, even though it doesn't say it completely outright, that this wasn't a normal spot for them to go. It wasn't part of their normal fishing grounds. It wasn't a part of their comfortable and well-known routine. Go out there to that place that you haven't gone to before or for a long time and try again. Again, we could probably stop right there. Maybe you're wishing that I would. And just let that be the sermon. Going to a place, a new place, a place of depth, and trying again. They initially voice some doubts and some tiredness, like, oh, we just fished all night. But then Peter says, if you say so, we will do it. And as I was writing this sermon, I wrote this line, and now I'm going to read it, but I'm a little apprehensive about it. So they initially voiced their doubts, and then Peter says, if you say so, we will do it. And then I wrote, thus inventing the reverse of the game Simon Says. And that is exactly the same response I got this morning. It is a very subtle and also a very bad joke about the game Simon Says. So I apologize, but it caused me, when I was writing it, it came across like a good joke. But it is not. So I apologize, but I wanted to share that this morning. So they go to the deep waters. They go to this new place. And their catch is so big, I mean, that's a good thing, that their boat starts to sink. So they panic, they call for help, and they make it safely to shore, where Peter seems to have an epiphany, right? Where he seems to be like, this person told us to go to that specific spot, and in that specific spot was abundance, where we had just spent a long time without abundance, without anything happening. And he has this strange reaction. And what does he do? Rather than running to Jesus and throwing himself at his feet and saying, wherever you go, I will follow, what does he say? I'm a sinner. He says, go away from me. I'm not worthy. I'm a sinner, which is an interesting response. But it doesn't seem to bother Jesus at all, where Peter's like, I'm a sinner. Go away from me or I'll go away from you. He seems to just see potential in Peter and tells him to get up and don't be afraid. And he tells him, in some ways, in slightly different language, that they now have a job to do that is both very much the same and completely different from what they know. And I will say that this story, in a way, reminds me of my own call story. And as I say that, I do and I don't want to equate my call story to that of Peter and the first disciples. Obviously, it's very, very different because I didn't have Jesus physically standing there saying, you follow me. But it's the same because my very first thought when I got that sense of call, and I will point out that my call wasn't like a lightning bolt where it was just like all of a sudden the heavens opened and a voice said, I want you to go to seminary and then to move to Washington and pastor St. Peter. It wasn't quite that specific. But it was absolutely a sense of calling. And my very first reaction was, what? Like me? Because at the time I was playing in a rock band. I drank, I smoked, I had not taken a vow of celibacy, and I was not living a very pious life. And so for there to be something stirring in my heart and my soul that said, this is the path for you, it was ridiculous. And I thought, well, me? I'm a sinner. I am unworthy of this. I am ill-equipped for this. But it didn't seem to matter to Jesus in regards to Peter or us. The things that we think make us ineligible or inappropriate for ministry don't seem to matter to Jesus. And in fact, they might even be the reason that we are called. And so Peter, after that moment, seems to kind of jump right into action, but for me it took a long time. It was less a moment of calling, and it was kind of a season where for an entire year I waffled back and forth between being excited and being terrified. And the whole time being incredulous, though, like, you sure you dialed the right number? Like, me. But through it all, Jesus sought me. Jesus sought me. And that's the thing about this. As we start Lent, walking alongside Peter, we begin this Lenten journey with the foundational knowledge that Jesus seeks us. Always. Sometimes Jesus seeks us with holy work to do, often work that comes out of not the parts of our lives that are shiny and spotless and polished, but often out of the parts of our lives that are scarred and messy. There's a reason that people who lead Alcoholics Anonymous groups tend to be recovering alcoholics, right? There's this peculiar thing, and Henry Nouwen called it the wounded healer, that the most fruitful, the most powerful, the most important place of ministry for us all is out of the places that we are broken. And we have struggled, and we have learned and gotten wizened. And Jesus seeks us with a call to do some work sometimes in those kinds of places. But sometimes Jesus seeks us to be a companion, to offer comfort when we are low. And sometimes Jesus seeks us almost offering like a new pair of glasses that give us a new perspective that might liberate us from old beliefs or old thinking that keeps us captive, but still always seeking us. Even when we wax and wane in our faith, which we all do, even as we bounce back and forth in our lives from faith to doubt and then back to faith again, even as we wander, Jesus seeks us. I think one of the most beautiful parts about our text this morning is that Peter doesn't entirely understand. Like, he has a moment where he kind of gets it, right? After Jesus sends him out and says, go there to deep water, he rushes, he gets back on land and he immediately goes over to him and falls to his knees. He seems to get that Jesus is special and unique and powerful, but he also doesn't understand that Jesus isn't judging him or worrying about his worthiness or sinfulness. Peter sort of falls for the old value system in thinking that his sinfulness, his humanness, his brokenness disqualifies him from being close to God or being used by God. And when he does that, Jesus catches him, not necessarily in the fisherman net kind of catching, but almost like Peter's falling, and Jesus catches him from falling back into an old understanding. Our theme song for this Lent is the one we opened worship with, "Come thou fount of every blessing." And I hope you can hear the echoes of it today, particularly the one line we sang. I think it's the first line in the second verse, maybe third verse. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. This morning, Jesus seeks Peter, and in doing so reminds us that there is this amazing gift of faith, that Jesus seeks us in our everyday world. Jesus seeks us on our Tuesdays, as mundane as it gets, and calls us into a place where abundance comes. Calls us to where the deep water is, calls us to a place where abundance is and comes into our lives in unexpected ways that changes our lives forever. And so this Lent and this life, may it be so. In God's grace.